Welcome to the Mason Duchatschek Show. This episode is brought to you by Workforce Alchemy, helping leaders improve hiring, engagement, and retention while uncovering people-related profit leaks hidden in everyday operations. Today's guest sits at the intersection of science, strategy, and the future of work. Dr. Michelle Griffin is an industrial organizational psychologist, seasoned HR executive, and the founder and CEO of Griffin Resources, where she helps organizations build people systems that actually scale. With a PhD in IO psychology and years of experience leading and advising growing companies, Dr. Griffin brings a rare, evidence-based perspective to hiring, to culture, and compliance in workforce strategy. Her work focuses on future-proofing HR, designing hiring and talent practices that don't just solve today's problems, but prepare organizations for what's coming next. If you're a business owner, CEO, or HR leader thinking about how to attract better talent, reduce risk, and build a workforce that can adapt and endure, this conversation will challenge how you think about hiring and human resources. Dr. Griffin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your journey from HR director to CEO and founder is inspiring. Tell me how that happened.
It was sort of intentional and sort of accidental. So as I was getting my PhD, I was still in the corporate world. And the more I got involved in my own research, the more I thought it was unfair to take my time away from my corporate position. So I ended up speaking with my CEO at the time, and we discussed a 90-day exit strategy for me to go independent. They were very, very supportive. They realized that was a really great move for the next part of my career. They actually became a client. And within that timeline, I lined up a couple clients, and I thought I would just continue to be an independent contractor while I finished my PhD. Fortunately or unfortunately, as I decided to not turn away work, I just added on more clients and added on team members. So very quickly, within about 3 months of having my own clientele, I hired 2 full-time employees. That was at the very end of 2019 into 2020. And so then I just continued to help those companies through COVID. We learned a lot about kind of not only being a consultant, but also helping a company from the inside. A lot of them would give us internal email address, have us work directly with their employees as if we were an internal HR person. And that became the premise of what I built as we continued to grow. We actually had some clients kind of say we felt more like insourcing than outsourcing, and that became the model of what we built. Over time, it just made more sense to figure out a billing structure for that and a support structure from the inside. And so I now have a pretty large firm. Right now, we have about 40 team members and about 85 clients worldwide. We do have some parent companies that are international, and we support their domestic staff here in the US. It has really been rewarding to work with all different types of company sizes and business owners that really felt the need and desire to, kind of build something that was special to their company and unique to their culture. We have been able to work with some companies for many years now. Since I've had it for 6 years, a lot of our clients have kept us that whole time. Other times they purposely outgrow us, and we help them stand on their own and move on without us, which has been really special too. So
Cool.
that's what I ended up building.
Cool. So industrial organizational psychology is a lens most leaders don't get to look through. So how has that academic foundation influenced the way that you advise companies on things like hiring and culture?
So I look at it both from a very scientific academic lens, some of it from my own research and some of it from just understanding how to make a practical application of the science, especially having been in both HR and studying IO psychology. So I try to break it down and not get too boring with them, but really understand like some of the best practices that science has found, and then how do they make that part of their own processes, and what is important to them, the ROI behind that, and how that helps solve their problems. From a hiring perspective, we are able to really help them go from just unstructured interviews to really understand how they can increase the validity of hiring by doing structured interviews, bringing in assessments, and adding some scientific value to how they're hiring people. Once we were able to do that, we reduced their turnover, which means people are involved in the company longer, which everyone kind of knows that turnover has a price tag to it. But not only is it just the cost of hiring that person's replacement, but it's also that value that person brings to the company by staying longer and being a part of the culture, and then maybe referring their colleagues and friends to work at the same company, and they all continue to work longer together and then help align their growth in their career with the company's growth and structure and things like that. So it kind of has a holistic approach behind it. My own research, I wanted to understand how people communicate using technology. I did decide on my topic before COVID hit, but it became extremely relevant in COVID because a lot of people were getting a little nervous about using technology to communicate. People were still waiting to have some conversations in person, or they might pick up the phone getting written in an email, and what they trusted, what they didn't trust. And I just took it one step further to look at something as far as that communication and human interaction across international borders, just to create a more complex structure of what it looked like if you were working with someone in different states, different backgrounds, and in my case, different cultures and industries across countries. But it became kind of a universal idea of how to help people feel comfortable and interact, and how do you take that from a remote environment versus an in-person environment. So now we've had a lot of questions about how we can help companies when they may have a hybrid environment or a remote environment, and what are some things they can do to keep people engaged and involved in their companies. So that's how it's really helped.
So when you say future-proof HR, what does that truly mean in practical terms for business leaders right now?
It's really a strategic approach to, essentially a lot of times companies don't face their own mortality in the way that the economy or their industries are rapidly changing. AI has a big say in a lot of that. We've all kind of seen some huge companies that just all of a sudden disappeared because they really didn't keep up with the times, like Blockbuster. They could have gone the way of Netflix and really, bought them and had a futuristic, streaming application, and they didn't. So really being able to understand where the future is going and aligning your humans with it. How much of a human touch do you need? How much of an AI can automate your processes? How can you do more with less? Or how can you increase your resources and upskill your people? So a lot of it is that kind of approach of where can you really see your business as fast as the economy or the technology is changing, and being able to keep up with it and try to predict it.
So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see companies making in their hiring processes that are leaving them, for lack of a better word, unprepared for tomorrow's workforce?
A lot of times it's not necessarily the recruiting process. It's really kind of the caliber of the person that they're looking for, and being able to understand how that person is going to impact the organization, and then being able to onboard them and probably properly keep them ingrained into the company. Hiring managers really have no idea what to do with a person as soon as they show up in the organization. And then that person may feel isolated. They may not feel supported. They may not have the right resources. So it's about being prepared to integrate a new person into your company, and how to keep your culture in essentially intentional, and that it is something that you want your entire organization to move in the same direction, and every single person in your company matters. And you really have to understand and see that, and make sure that every person knows where their value is in the organization. I mean, that's kind of why we had that whole quiet quitting culture. We may still see that quite often, is because people just were like, well, why would I output so much if the company's not going to input into me? And, they're like, I'm just here to collect a paycheck. Well, that doesn't really feel good on the output of that person, because they're going to be they're going to be interacting with other employees, clients, outward facing, everyone in the company is essentially a salesperson for either what the company does or what the company is moving forward, and how they work together. So it's really important that companies really see their human capital as their biggest asset, and what that means for their business, because pretty much every business has people, and human resources is not just necessarily benefits and payroll. It's really, how do you integrate every single person in your organization into a culture and a company and a mission that you want and you have as an organization.
So what words of wisdom or advice do you have for employers who are struggling to source enough quality applicants to the point that they can be very picky?
there's a lot to unpack in that question. It's really important that companies know their value to people. We actually had an internal struggle with that right around our year 3. It wasn't necessarily because of the age of the company, but it was also the shift from we have a very remote environment. Like what we do is very remote. We do have some people that go on site, but not a lot. At that point is when COVID was kind of relieving. People were able to go back to work. It wasn't a requirement to work remote anymore. We were having some turnover issues. So we turned our best practices internal to ourselves, had our own leadership coach reach out to everyone in the company and ask, why do you work here and what keeps you coming back? And from that, we learned some of our own value structure of why it was a good place to work. And we were able to express that to other people that we were looking to bring on board and say, this is what we do best. This is what we have to offer. And if this is the same thing you are looking for, this is a great place to work. If this is not what you're looking for, it's not a great place for you either, and it's not going to work out. We've also had several team members leave and come back. And so we've also asked them, like, what brings you back and why? Being able to ask your own people what it is that's important to them and being able to replicate that and express it is important. Aligning your interviewing of the person to make sure they're a fit for the company and the role is important, but also making sure that it is going to align with their own purpose and their own work-life balance, things like that. For us, that ended up being that we do have a lot of work-life balance. We give a lot of flexibility. So people that prioritize family as well as work, we found that that was good during COVID. And those that have continued along those lines of making sure that they put family first or they put their other priorities first, we make sure that people are seen valued and heard and they have their time off, they take their vacation time, things like that, versus some cultures may not want to prioritize that for their people. So there's just some things that some people might say, well, I feel bad if I take my vacation time. If that's you want people working really hard for you and you don't want them taking a lot of time off, then great. But if you really don't want people having burnout or other issues, and you want to make sure that they feel okay taking their vacation, they feel supported, things like that. Those are just certain things of knowing how people feel about working there is important.
So I'm going to throw in a little twist because I just read an article and I think it was in the Atlantic the other day, not positive. But what they were talking about is with AI coming along, it's difficult, as if it wasn't difficult before, to identify job applicants who have the skills to succeed, particularly at entry level positions. And they were talking about how AI, just because someone has a college degree, they're saying, well, do they really have the skills? Because we're at that transitional point where a lot of these folks are using AI in college and like, do they really have these skills or did AI do all this? I don't know what
Mhm.
I'm getting, like as if it was easy before when it wasn't. But what do you say to employers who have plenty of applicants, but are finding it harder to determine what they really bring to a job because of AI?
So there's a certain point where you have to embrace the fact that they are going to continue to use AI in the workforce and how they use technology. It's no different than saying, do you know how to use Excel or do you know how to use Word? There are certain just skill sets that people are going to need. And you are going to have to be able to figure out how to interview for that, how to question them for that, and how to assess for that. And, it's something that you really just have to learn as part of it's kind of behavioral interviewing. You ask a lot of questions about scenarios and how would they problem solve? How are they going to find solutions? And if they say, well, I'm going to go ask AI, how would I do this? That's great. You still have to be the one to go execute it. And so, as long as they understand how to use resources, I think that's really important. It's funny that you bring up, I hope you can find the article because it'd be great to reference. But I honestly just got a text message from a friend of mine and we were talking about Copilot. It was just kind of a funny prompt that I had on mine. I was like, I feel kind of seen/creeped out because it was very predictive. And he had said that he had lost a project that he wrote and he couldn't locate it. And so he asked Copilot, can you locate the document for me? And it said, no, I can't, but I do know how you wrote it and I can rewrite it for you. And it rewrote it for him. And he said it was better than the original.
Wow.
So it's definitely getting a little weird, but it's like, how can you make it so that it is supportive of your work and, something that is valuable to the company? And it's just because you don't want humans to become totally obsolete. You definitely need to understand your resources and how to improve. and again, do more with less resources. So that's really comes into upskilling the people and people right out of college. And I know this because I'm asked to guest lecture at universities that are trying to make sure that they're keeping up with the times. And how do they do the same thing with making sure people are prepared to be in the workforce? What are the workforce looking for? How can they make sure that the next generations coming out of universities are able to, be able to perform at that level? And so there's multiple times that I will help universities and professors kind of understand what is happening in the workforce. And it's part of those problems are in the universities, they're saying don't use it at all. But that's like saying don't use a calculator or don't use Excel. Like you have to, and you have to know your tools. And we have to continue to grow and change as technology is changing.
I think businesses are going to really have to reevaluate what they're looking for in the jobs, because you said something. There's two things you said that jumped out at me. Are these applicants solution finders or are they problem solvers? I went through college and I was Army ROTC. The becoming an Army officer paid for my college. But if I'm out in the woods during a rainstorm in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, I'm not going to AI to say, hey, how can I solve this problem? I need to be able to figure something out. I need to be able to think on my feet. I need to be able to collaborate and cooperate with my team. And we need to figure out a solution quickly. That was an important skill that I really value now that I developed early because of the positions that I was in. But now, if you have my son, he's been out of college a couple of years. He's expert solution finder. He can go on the internet and find a solution quickly. And we actually had this debate one time, and I was like, Clayton, why don't you just figure this out? He goes like, why wouldn't you just look it up? If I can look up the answer and have it in a few seconds, and you're going to figure it out, and it's going to take a few minutes, who's the dummy? And he had
Yeah.
a point.
And it's definitely one of those things where it's like you have to, I think, maybe have a little bit of both because there's also the situation of, we are starting to see technology glitches, blackouts, and, there was multiple blackouts in Europe that happened even, as recently as just I think like a month ago, they had like a 2-day blackout over, I think it was just a few months ago, Spain and Portugal had like a 2-day blackout. So we're starting to see these infrastructure issues. And I think we honestly just had a Verizon blackout like 2 days ago. So people are not able to rely on technology unilaterally. And so if it is there, great, and you know what to do with it. If it's not there, are you going to be able to solve this on your own? Can you think for yourself? And, it's like, so I really feel like people have to be able to do both. And you have to, I think, also find creative ways to use the tools. Like, I was kind of the same thing with you. I grew up in Alaska. And so we were taught how to survive in the wilderness literally when I was in elementary school. I weirdly know how to navigate by the stars because if you get stuck, if you're lost in the winter and you have nothing and no idea where to go, you at least know which way is like north, south, east, or west. I honestly have no other sense of direction because I can't navigate by the sun because, well, in Alaska, it doesn't really go across the sky. It doesn't go east to west. Um, but weirdly, I can navigate by the North Star. Um, but I also started realizing at some point if you are even just trying to put something together in your house or something's broken and you don't have the exact right tool, what other tools do you have? You're like, well, I don't have a Phillips screwdriver with this exact head. It's like, well, that's fine. What else can you have in your house? And how else can you solve this problem? And I feel like the same kind of thing happens in multiple working situations where it's like, if you don't have the exact right tool, are you just going to sit there and wait for the tool to come available again? And you're like, I can't work for 2 days because the system's down, or are you going to find a way to solve it yourself or figure out new or innovative ways? And I think that's also kind of like we're waiting for that innovation to happen from either developers or AI to advance itself and versus, also staying on the forefront of being innovative ourselves.
I'm fascinated to see how the workforce and employers adapt in their selection processes to be able to
Hmm.
evaluate those kind of things. Because
Yeah.
if someone's like, hey, because that is a legitimate answer. I could see an applicant fresh out of college say, well, I can't work then. Like if the stuff, I don't have the tools, I don't have the stuff, then what do you expect me to do? Being honest, and that is, I'm not saying that's something that would attract me as an employer, but they're not
Hmm.
lying. I mean, they're at least like, well, that's what I've been trained to do. And I'm really, really good at it when I have these tools. Watch me go.
Hmm.
and they double down
Yeah.
on the strength, like, I could see that.
Yeah, and a lot of teachers, even in younger education, are saying critical thinking skills are lacking. And, there's really the idea of we have to teach critical thinking so that people can, learn and grow and, be fast thinkers or even problem solvers versus doers. And, the argument of our education was built for factory workers, 150 years ago. We have to be able to keep up with the education of what's needed for today. And, we're just advancing so much. You can either essentially use your education system to train everyday workers, or you can train them to be critical thinkers. And you really have to teach them, unfortunately or fortunately, to challenge what the status quo is. And, that's kind of one of the things that is, nice when you have a diverse workforce. You have people with other backgrounds and unique ideas, and they will basically say, well, how about this idea, or why do we do it that way? And the horrible idea of the answer is, oh, it's because it's always been done that way. But that's not a good reason to keep doing it that way. And so finding new and innovative thinkers and problem solvers and keeping those kinds of new ideas in your workforce is great. And that's where, behavioral interview questions are really helpful to kind of say, if this happens, and you can use even, problems that happen in your workforce in currently to say, if you have this problems, how would you solve it? And it's really interesting when people will ask those kinds of things in interviews, because you might actually get an answer in your organization that you can apply. And great,
Sure.
maybe you even have a new great employee out of the questions with your interviews. And it's really kind of nice when some, I would say, like, it doesn't always have to be an internship program, but if you kind of reach out to, know, other workers and things like that, kind of just same kind of thing, challenge them, see how they answer it. And, maybe you can also kind of start to figure out a younger workforce, and how you can bring them into the organization. And again, if an internship program works for you, great. And if it doesn't, at least you can start to kind of figure out how to help, those types of peoples and jobs and things like that with other organizations. And a lot of times I've seen business owners, just interact with the universities through, just different programs and things like that. And even though, like, I personally can't hire people right out of college, just because we need people with years of experience to do what we do to bring the services to our clients, that doesn't mean that I don't personally go and work with the universities to do resume reviews and help them with interviewing skills and things like that. And I get to, also same kind of thing. I was working with a high school at one point and got to ask the high school students what they would do in some of these problems. And it was kind of this cool workshop that was put together by the McDonald Foundation that brought all these high school students together and had them problem solve for real corporate problems. And it was crazy what they came up with. And a lot of those solutions were actually implemented by the McDonald Foundation, which was pretty cool.
So culture is often labeled as critical, but sometimes it's kind of hard to define. Can you share any ideas or insights on how companies can build cultures that support innovation and retention?
Yeah, so it's culture is one of those things that it's openly discussed as a generalized term, but really it's the just the thought process of everyone cultivating and working together. And how do they all see the same work structure and workforce? So there's a lot of ideas to kind of keeping people innovative, and a lot of that comes with autonomy and free thinking and being able to express themselves and problem solve and things like that. Google has a real famous one for being able to, and I forget how they used it, but I want to say, like, either like an hour or two a day or whatever their time block was, they could allow team members to just come up with any solution that they wanted. And that's how we got, Google Maps. That's how we got Gmail, was they just let them come up with their own projects. And a lot of companies, just if you give them the ability to problem solve and do team working and do creative things together, that can be one way to create a culture of innovation. But again, it has to be something that you decide to do as a collective process and thought through intention. For the retention part of it, a lot of that has to come with, making sure people feel seen and heard, and that they feel like they belong there. They see themselves there for a long period of time. They get the same kind of value and purpose in being there. People are obviously pretty community based animals. And so being able to find that purpose in the community and finding value in where you work is important. So if a lot of times we're seeing in new generations, turnover a lot faster. Every generation is leaving jobs faster and faster. And to the point now where this latest generation is leaving in less than 12 months. And a lot of it is because if they're not seeing any kind of real value, they'll just turn around and leave again. And they'll just keep trying new things and finding new things. And that's how we get the gig economy and the gig worker. It's because they'll just take a few part-time jobs and they're good with kind of figuring out how to make ends meet versus, being able to say, I've been in a company for 15 years. Like that doesn't happen anymore. So there's real, there has to be incentive for that, but there has to be aligning of why should they stay and where's that retention purpose coming from. But it just, if you really have to think about what kind of structure and purpose are you giving to your employees, but also to your clients, and can you articulate that? Does everyone in the company kind of feel the same way? A good exercise is if you just give a survey to the company and ask people to describe the company in 5 words, and hopefully you kind of get a very similar message and eventually very similar context. And then you create your kind of core values and structure from there. But it's a good idea to figure out how everyone feels about the company and things like that. And if that's the intent that the owner or leadership have for the company. And then just, if it's not, then you're obviously misaligned, and making sure that you're being a little more intentional and vocal about that. A lot of times I often will encourage companies to take their marketing and turn it internal. So whatever you're doing external for your marketing, definitely make sure that everyone is speaking the same language. And there's so often times when you're out networking or just out seeing people, there's very few, very same common things in the United States that people get asked. And it's pretty much, how are you doing? Where do you work? What are you doing these days?
Sure.
And, so every single person in your company, that's why I say everyone's a salesperson, because it's either going to be, it doesn't matter if it's your accountant or, your HR person, your salesperson, a leader, they're always going to be talking about where they work and how they feel about it. And it could either.
I've always felt that HR was the second sales force for most companies, and that companies should literally put as much effort into competing, just like a sales department competes to attract and identify and retain their best customers. HR is a second sales force that should fight with that same intensity and actual strategy to gain and retain top talent. I've
Hmm.
always felt that HR was a second sales force. I found it interesting you talked about how Google gave people, hey, just think about ways to solve problems. And you talked about how people were short on their resumes, like, oh, I only want to do this gig economy, or I only want to work here a year. Because I understand the converse of that is someone that says, well, they say they've got 10 years of experience with that company, but they don't have 10 years of experience. They got 1 year of experience, so they've done 10 times.
Hmm.
Me, I may have had 10 different roles, but I've learned new skills and made myself more valuable at every single stop. And they've got a point. But your example with Google is, if they're not just saying, hey, stay in your lane, do this, or saying, hey, think outside the box. What are some problems you can solve? And what are some ways we can do this? That is giving them new experience and new problems to solve. And that is the best of both worlds. If you ask me,
Hmm.
that struck out when you told me that. I was like, that's smart for those reasons. Cause then you might be able to retain some of those people that you might have lost after a year, for maybe
Hmm.
not 10 years or 15 years, but maybe 3 or 5 or 6, which is better than one, especially if they've got institutional knowledge and they're part of the culture that contributes. I know
Right.
you talk about psychological safety. How does that
Hmm.
intersect with performance expectations in high growth companies?
So a lot of times people or companies really focused on some of the psychological safety needs, mental health, and things of that during COVID. And some have really gotten away from that, especially as the economy has been harder and they're focusing more on the company itself surviving and growth and things like that. And so they often will forget about the needs of the people themselves. So having a focus on how people can be able to grow for themselves. So if we think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I assume a lot of people know what that is, but just for those that may not, it's just the idea that you have to have your basic needs met first before you can think about additional growth and personal needs beyond that. So if you are you don't have food or shelter, then you can't necessarily think about your going to work and being productive every day. And then on top of that, your relationships and being able to develop, a loving and caring relationship and things like that. And then eventually you get to the top, which is, having a self-fulfilling type situation of psychological awareness. And some of that could be religion and things like that. But it's the idea of, if you don't pay your people enough money and they're focused on their income, then that means they're not going to be the most productive person and being able to perform at their top, because they might need to be worried about, their family or getting a medication or something like that. So having the right foundation for the people so that you take money off the table, they're not worried about their benefits or their health care, and being able to have a sustainable life for themselves and their family. The next thing is, how are they going to show up to work every day, and how are they showing up for your company and your clients and their other team members? And so having companies being very aware of that, and even if the company can afford to do a pay increase just for the sake of economic changes from inflation, and saying, well, we're going to, not waiting until just their annual review just to do it for themselves for their performance review, just saying, everyone gets a 2% raise just because the economy is up 9%. Just, we're going to try to help out a little bit. Or the company is going to contribute a little bit more to benefits because, we know healthcare costs are increasing. So some of those things that, if a company can afford to do them, great, or at least acknowledging that they want to provide some support. And, it could just be changing some of your time off policies or some of those things that can just help be a little more supportive, making sure people feel comfortable coming forward if they have a situation at home that they need support with. If you have employee programs and things like that for addiction or mental health services, anything like that. So that's kind of all wraps around to that psychological safety of making sure that people mentally can show up to their best. And obviously, the ROI behind that is, the better they are at work, the better they are to perform, and the more you're going to get out of them. So it really is in a company's best interest to help the people, but also making sure it comes from a place of caring, and, that people feel seen and valued and heard. So that also helps with attention and everything else we've been talking about.
Sure. So, what are some, because I know you study this stuff and you do a ton of research, what are some underrated data points or analytics that leaders should be using to make smarter people decisions?
So there's a couple that I tend to rely on. Turnover numbers are a really good one. Depending on the size of the company, you can look at turnover by department, and there's another one is revenue by overhead. So you literally just take your full revenue and divide it by how many people you have. And that gives you a good idea. A lot of times you can actually, if you've got competitors that are public, those numbers are published and you can see how you're performing against your competitors. So a lot of times you'll want to understand how much input of people you're getting out of, of their revenue that you're generating. So some of those numbers are really easy to monitor, but you can really see if you are wasting money in any one location, if you've got people that are not contributing as much as you think they should and things like that. So some of those, like obviously sales KPIs, are pretty easy to see if people are hitting their numbers. But if you take an overall just revenue divided by your overhead, you'll start to see how much you're improving year over year. Or if you're, a lot of times people just throw bodies at problems, and versus implementing new technology, and how can they make sure that they're, again, upskilling their people so they're getting more out of them and that they're contributing more and better. And once you obviously stop your turnover and you have better retention, again, those people know how to do their jobs better, they can do them faster, and you get more again out of your people, and you should have higher revenue. So those are kind of some nice metrics to kind of help monitor and see the patterns of these stories.
That's good advice. There's a lot of companies out there that are saying, "Oh, my labor costs are going out of the clouds. What am I going to do?
Hmm.
We need more work done. We need more work done. We need to add X number more people. How are we going to do this?" And maybe they don't need more people. If they got 100 employees and the discretionary effort of their average employee is 50%, they're only getting the work accomplished to 50 people. They're paying for
Hmm.
100 people, but they're only getting and then they're wondering why their labor costs are high. So the
Yeah.
things that
A
you're
lot of
talking
times
about,
if you can look over turnover by department, you can catch a toxic manager. If your overall company doesn't necessarily have a lot of turnover, but one particular department does, that is an indication to go looking for some issues there. And oftentimes, like more than not, it's a toxic manager that you have to deal with. And you really have to make some tough decisions on if that, how that manager is performing for the company versus how it's performing for the rest of the people. And it's not always easy to solve some of those problems. But in some situations, we've helped them with leadership development, moved that manager from being a people manager so that they can help with maybe the strategy. So you don't have to lose that person altogether if they really do value the company, or bring value to the company. But, not everyone is a great people manager. And that's a learned skill set. It's not just because, you were good at their job, so you promoted them and they never really learned the skills on how to manage people. So those are some of the things we see quite often where people just kind of keep getting promoted and promoted, but never learned the skills. And so either we help them get there if that's really a good solution, or, just really make the right decisions for the company. But you really should, some of those numbers are key indicators to look for those problems and solve for them.
And if people are paying attention to the business, you said something there, it's not easy. And I don't know about you, but I see a lot of companies that don't do things that they should do for the health of the business because, oh, that's not easy.
Hmm.
You got to find a polite way to say, I don't care if it's not easy. It doesn't mean that it doesn't still need to be done. You just need to find a way. Or I get it. But I love that you said, well, it's not easy to do that. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean, that doesn't mean it
Yeah.
still doesn't need to be done. I guess you're going to have to do some hard things,
Yeah.
but
And oftentimes that's actually why we get hired. We've helped people, especially when you work with family members or someone that is really important to you, like a business partner and things like that. So we've let people go in the company that were really important, family members and things like that. So it's nice to have, someone to be there to do the hard things and then help keep the company on track, and then also try to make sure that those relationships don't kind of crumble. So we've definitely helped out in some of those sticky situations. I don't personally like to do them, which is why we have a leadership coach. Like I personally use my own leadership coach to even help my own team. We turned her in, like I mentioned, we turned her internally a few years ago. She's been with us since 2022. And so she actually was a client before this. And she was a COO of a company. And then she went independent when that company went under, and then asked to work with us. And then eventually we kind of turned her internally like that. But it really helped out. Like that's why I think so many companies, even with smaller teams, they need to know how to work together as a leadership team. Like you have to understand each other's communication styles. Like there's always going to be confrontation, and people aren't taught how to have difficult conversations and get through them and come out stronger and without resentment and things like that. So it's definitely difficult. Like I actually have several businesses with my husband, and it's probably good or bad thing I've studied psychology. So we've been able to, stay married and get through this and build our companies together. It's definitely something that is a learned skill, and it's also not a fun skill to learn.
no. So I really appreciate all your feedback, your insights. I hope everyone else listening is enjoying this as much as I am and has learned as much as I am. Looking forward maybe 3 to 5 years, what capability or talent strategies do you believe will separate the thriving companies from the ones who end up struggling?
So honestly, I think because technology is changing so quickly, 5 years from now feels like a really difficult thing to be able to predict. 3 years
Well, let's go
might
with
even
3.
be a
Let's
little
go with 3.
touchy. Yeah. So I'm hoping that the people skills are still really important. And I think that is going to be the differentiating factor for people. I think as long as companies are still humanizing their workforce, people are still being seen and valued and heard, and they are contributing to their community and their purpose, and they keep that top of mind, I feel like those are the companies that do well. I've seen company and business owners when they start to focus on they focus on the money and not their purpose and their people. I've seen them crumble. And if as soon as they, lose sight of why they went into business and who they do business with, and just say, I want more money, I want to sell my business, I want to get out from underneath this, it just crumbles, and they don't get the evaluation they want, they don't get the exit they want. And if they just keep going with their purpose, everything else follows behind that. And, they end up getting the ROI from the investments in that. So I honestly think the biggest differentiator is going to be the companies and the business owners that keep sight of their purpose and their people.
Thank you for that, because my gut, because I've got an opinion on that, and we're not that far off of yours either. I think that with the technology, like everything, I think there's going to be I think the pendulum is going to swing so far to AI and technology that there will be some backlash and it will come back
Hmm.
towards, and I don't know whether that's going to take 3 years or 5 years. It may not even take that long, but I'm already seeing, like, I know I've had friends that have interviewed for senior level positions where they've gone through multiple interviews and never talked to a live person. It was all AI.
Hmm.
And of course, they had great questions. And they're senior and they're very capable. But one particular person told me about this, and she said, "I withdrew my candidacy. I have no interest. I'm not a robot.
Hmm.
I am a human. I am capable of interacting with people. I have people skills, and I'm not going to lose them. And I'm not going to let a computer decide whether or not I can be a good fit for this company. And I don't want to work for a company where that's the culture that they want." Like, she literally withdrew her candidacy. She's like, I have no interest in working in a company at all like that.
Hmm.
Now the company that's doing that is sitting there looking at the metrics, thinking, "Oh, look how fast we're getting through our processes. Look how few man hours we're getting to get through." And I've seen other companies where they're like, "Look at how fast we're bringing people through our recruiting funnel." And of course, their turnover is high, and they're losing people just as fast in the back door that you can bring them in the front door. But they think their hiring metrics are amazing, and because look how efficient we are, look how fast we are. It's like, hey, if you went up and you did it right the first time, you wouldn't have to repeat it over and
Hmm.
over and over again. But I think there is going to be that shift towards over reliance on technology, and there's going to be some blowback, and it's going to come back. And I think that people are going to be craving the human experience and interaction. We can play this interview back a few years from now and see if we were right. But I'm willing to bet on us. I think we're going. I think I'm willing to bet on us that we're going to be right, and you can look back and you got proof that we called it early. But I really appreciate all your time. I got one last question for you before I ask how people can get a hold of you. I know you've got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. If there was only one piece of advice that you could give to business owners or CEOs or executives, and it was your one chance to give the most important piece of advice you could offer, what would it be and why?
Oh, a lot of things just went through my brain. So, as a business owner myself, I would say, like, looking back, the one piece of advice that I wish I would have understood better, and it took me years to know this, was, and a lot of people will say the old adage of working in your business versus on your business kind of situation, or on your business versus in it will help you scale. But I took what I knew, which was HR, and turned it into a service offering. What I had to learn was how to run a business, and running a business and being able to, I no longer perform HR duties. And that's actually, and that was my background. Depending on where CEOs are in their journey as a startup or as a multi-million dollar business, you have to be able to, you know, pivot and morph and grow, and to, depending on where your goals are and what you want to do, and being able to help others replicate what you perform or provide as a service. And so those are probably some of the harder skills that I had to understand and learn the rest of the business. Like, obviously, I have accountants. I can understand accounting. I'm not an accountant, but I definitely don't rely on opening up my business to fraud because I've let somebody else handle the whole thing. I still oversee quite a bit in different areas of the business, including the services we perform. But as a business owner, I purposely wanted to pivot into being able to understand and oversee all of the functions of the business as it is. And I've had to learn new skills to do that, in stepping away from performing the job itself, as I, went from being an independent contractor all the way up to, a multi-million dollar business owner. So I would say giving yourself a lot of grace. Don't give up during the hard times, and, pivot and morph and grow in yourself and for your business.
So for people who want to know more about you and the work you do in your company, what are the best ways for them to connect with you?
The website is the best. It's griffin-resources.com, and it has direct contact information and a chat and everything else to get a hold of me and us. We're
Cool. Are
still
you
pretty
active
small.
on any social channels, LinkedIn? YouTube, any of those others?
So LinkedIn and actually going to our website, there's links to all the social media. So there's
Very cool.
LinkedIn, there's Facebook, there's Instagram, there's a YouTube channel. So as we talk with other people and any kind of connections to podcasts like this, we also try to link them through our social media as well, and so hopefully I can help continue to get this message out. But yeah, it's definitely pretty easy to find us starting with the website and then going out from there.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone listening enjoyed this as much as I did and learned as much as I did. I really appreciate your time. I had a great time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
Thanks so much.